Okay, imagine this. You're looking back at the last 10 years of your life here in Canada. Think about like your job, your housing situation, even how safe you feel walking around your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then what if we took all of those pieces and kind of put them together and ask ourselves like a really basic question. Are things actually better for you right now than they were back in 2015? Here at Dansplain, we've been going deep on this really comprehensive report that does exactly that. No political debates, just looking at the hard data, comparing Canada to other big economies like the U.S., Germany, Japan, those big players. And I'm Edward.
I'm Lily, and welcome to this deep dive.
So our mission today is pretty simple. We want to cut through all the noise out there and give you a clear, evidence-based picture of how Canada's actually done over the last decade. And the big question we're tackling is, are Canadians better off today here in March 2025 than we were back in 2015?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when we compare ourselves to those global powerhouses, right? So we're going to unpack things like economic performance, how much wealth we have per person and how productive we are as a country. And then we'll look at affordability, that whole housing crisis and the general cost of living, and we'll dig into inequality, how financially secure Canadians are feeling, and even take a look at crime rates and ultimately try to assess the overall quality of life in Canada. And, it's interesting, this 10-year window from 2015 to 2025, it kind of aligns with a pretty significant period of governance here in Canada, which gives us like a solid time frame to consider how policies might have impacted things. But remember, we're sticking to the data itself.
Absolutely.
All right, Lily, let's dive right in when we talk about the economy. What's the big headline here?
Well, we got to start with GDP per capita growth. You've probably heard everyone talking about economic growth, and on the surface, the numbers for Canada do look like things have increased. Between 2015 and 2025, our GDP per capita went up by about 33.8%, reaching roughly $57,500 in U.S. dollars.
Okay, so a 33.8% increase. At first glance, that sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah.
But is that growth something that everyone's feeling equally? And how does it actually compare to other countries?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? So while that 33.8% sounds decent enough on its own, the picture gets a lot more complicated when we start comparing ourselves to how other countries did over the same period. Like, take the U.S., for example. They saw a much bigger jump, 43.4% growth. And even the UK, Germany, France, they all outperformed Canada in terms of GDP per capita growth during those 10 years. And here's where things get really interesting when you factor in the cost of living. How much you're actually paying for basic stuff like groceries, and this is big housing. Canada's position doesn't look so great. Those rising prices eat into those income gains. So the real increase in your purchasing power could be much smaller than that initial 33.8% suggests.
Right. It's not just about the size of the pie, but how big your slice is after you've paid for all the essentials.
Exactly.
Okay, so besides the overall growth, what are some of the deeper indicators of our economic health that this report looks at?
So a more fundamental issue, and this one's maybe a bit more worrying, is productivity. So Canada's real GDP per capita growth has averaged just 0.4% each year since 2014. And to put that in perspective, the average for all OECD countries, those developed nations, during that same time was 1.4%. This is a major indicator of our long-term economic health because it shows how efficiently we as a country are producing goods and services.
So while other leading countries are getting more efficient and wealthier per person, Canada's just kind of creeping along that slow growth that has big consequences for everyone's future prosperity. What's causing this low productivity growth?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the report points to a few interconnected things. One major factor is declining business investment. Canadian businesses just haven't been putting enough money into important areas like new technologies and equipment, which are essential for driving innovation and making things more efficient. And on top of that low business investment, we also have relatively low spending on research and development. Canada only invests about 1.7% of its total economic output in R&D. Just to give you a sense of the gap, the U.S. invests double that at 3.4%. And tying this all together, a significant portion of Canada's economic growth lately has come from population increases through immigration rather than actual gains in how efficiently we produce stuff.
So we're adding more people to the economy, which increases the overall output, but each person isn't actually becoming more productive in their work.
Exactly. And while having more people can be good, relying on that as the main driver without fixing those underlying productivity issues makes us vulnerable in the long run. In fact, projections show that Canada might have the lowest GDP per capita growth out of all the OECD countries from 2030 to 2060, which is a pretty big red flag suggesting that we might be slipping behind globally.
That's a pretty concerning prediction. What role has the government played in all of this? Immigration has obviously been a key policy.
Yeah, the government has definitely used immigration as a way to make the Canadian economy bigger overall. However, this report suggests that this strategy hasn't really addressed the root causes of our slow productivity growth. There hasn't been enough focus on creating an environment that really pushes for innovation, investing in modern infrastructure, and giving businesses real incentives to invest in things that make them more productive.
It sounds like our approach is pretty different from some of those more successful economies we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Think about the United States, where they've really focused on deregulation and fostering a culture of innovation. Those have been big drivers of their strong productivity growth. Or look at Germany with their Industry 4.0 initiative, which is all about using digital tech and automation in manufacturing, specifically designed to make their industries more efficient. Canada seems to be lagging behind in these key areas, maybe focusing more on getting more people into the economy rather than making each person more efficient in their work.
So it sounds like the headline might be economic growth, but the reality is a bit more complicated, with some serious challenges that could affect how well off Canadians are in the future.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, let's shift gears to something that's on everyone's mind these days, the cost of living, especially that housing crisis. The report paints a pretty bleak picture, right?
Yeah, it does. Since 2015, housing affordability in Canada has gotten way worse. The data is pretty clear on that. Average home prices across the country have gone up a whopping 33% just since 2019. And in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver, those increases have been even crazier by 2022. A full 50% of Canadians said they were worried about being able to afford housing. Can you imagine that? Half the population struggling with something as basic as keeping a roof over their heads.
Half the country worried about something so fundamental, and it's not just about owning a home anymore, is it? This affects renters too.
You got to think about this. For 5 quarters in a row leading up to 2023, mortgage payments and utilities ate up half of the average Canadian's disposable income. That leaves a lot less money for everything else. Groceries, transportation, saving for the future. And if you're renting, it's not much better. By September 2023, the average rent across Canada was a painful $2,149.
Ouch. That's a huge part of anyone's budget, and it's not just housing. It feels like everything is getting more expensive.
You're telling me those everyday essentials like food and heat, they've gone up so much, often faster than wages have increased. And in early 2024, almost half of Canadians said these rising costs were seriously affecting their ability to just make ends meet. It's putting a ton of financial pressure on Canadian families.
So what has the government done to try and tackle this affordability crisis?
Well, they've introduced some programs like the first-time home buyer incentive, but the report says these haven't been enough to make a real difference. In fact, like we talked about with economic growth policies that have encouraged fast population growth without a matching increase in the number of houses, have probably made the problem even worse. And then you add things like zoning regulations and slow permitting processes that make it hard to build new homes, and you've got a situation where way more people want homes than there are homes available.
And those interest rate hikes by the Bank of Canada, while they're meant to control inflation, they've made borrowing, especially for mortgages, a lot more expensive.
Exactly, and those hikes are happening within the bigger picture of the government's overall financial policies, so they're all connected.
It feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. How do other developed countries manage to keep housing and living costs more stable?
That's a good question. Look at Germany, for example. They have more efficient permitting processes and some forms of rent control, which have helped keep their housing market more stable and predictable. Or Japan, they have more flexible zoning laws and they're proactive about public housing, which helps keep housing prices more affordable, even with a system that factors in depreciation of housing assets, encouraging new construction. It seems like Canada is struggling more in these fundamental areas.
So the bottom line on affordability is that it's gotten a lot worse since 2015 for both people trying to buy a home and people renting.
Exactly. Whether you're trying to get your first place or just make rent and buy groceries each month, the report shows that Canada has really fallen behind other developed countries, and the government's actions so far haven't really addressed the root of the problem.
Now let's look at how wealth is spread out in Canada. The report digs into income inequality and how financially secure Canadians are feeling. What did they find?
So beyond just the average income, it's important to see how that wealth is distributed. Canada's Gini coefficient, which is basically a measure of income inequality, it stayed pretty stable between 2015 and 2020. But the report says this doesn't tell the whole story. There's a growing gap that's hidden beneath the surface.
So the overall numbers might not look too different, But the reality for people at different income levels could be changing a lot.
Right. The data shows that the highest earners in Canada have gotten a much bigger share of the economic gains, while middle and lower income households are dealing with more debt and less savings, which means a big chunk of the population is becoming more financially vulnerable. And just to give you an idea, by early 2024, a quarter of Canadians said they had to borrow money just to cover their everyday expenses. That's a pretty clear sign of financial strain.
Having to borrow money just to afford basic necessities, that's a really tough situation. And I imagine unexpected expenses can push families over the edge.
Absolutely. And this financial fragility is even clearer when you consider that in late 2022, 1 in 4 Canadians said they wouldn't be able to handle a sudden expense of just $500. That's a big red flag for financial insecurity. And as you might expect, this is hitting certain groups harder: younger Canadians, renters, single parent families. They're all having to put off major life events like buying a home or starting a family because of money problems.
So while some people are doing well, a lot of Canadians are feeling squeezed. What has the government done to try and help people who are struggling financially?
They've got programs like the Canada Child Benefit, and there have been minimum wage increases in some provinces. These things definitely provide some support, but the report says they haven't been enough to keep up with how fast the cost of living has gone up. And on top of that, the way taxes and government transfers work to reduce inequality has actually gotten weaker since the 1990s, so they're less effective now.
It sounds like those traditional safety nets aren't working as well as they used to. How do other developed countries compare when it comes to supporting people financially and reducing inequality?
That's a great point of comparison. Take France, for example. They have really strong social programs and a tax system that takes more from higher earners, which means they have way less income inequality. Or Germany, they have strong worker protections and a comprehensive social insurance system, which helps keep people more financially secure compared to these countries. Canada's lagging behind in providing that same level of security and dealing with income gaps.
So even if the big picture numbers on inequality haven't changed drastically, the reality is that a lot of Canadians are feeling more vulnerable financially, and our systems aren't keeping up. Okay, let's move on to another important topic: crime rates. What does the report tell us about safety and security in Canada over the last 10 years?
So this is where the news isn't so good. We've actually seen a pretty worrying rise in violent crime in some Canadian cities like Toronto since 2015, including more serious crimes like homicides and assaults, which is obviously a big concern for everyone's safety.
That's definitely unsettling. Are there specific types of crime that have increased more than others?
Yeah, the report points to a particular increase in gun violence and gang activity, which are big factors in that overall rise in violent crime. And then there's the whole cybercrime situation. While traditional property crimes like break-ins have stayed fairly steady, cybercrimes like fraud and identity theft have exploded in our digital world, and those can have huge financial and personal impacts.
So whether it's worries about safety in our communities or online,
Hmm.
it seems like things might have gotten worse since 2015. What has the government been doing about this?
Well, they've definitely tried to do things. They've brought in stricter gun control laws and increased funding for police in some places. But according to the report, these efforts haven't really turned the tide. The report actually suggests that not putting enough money into social programs that address the root causes of crime, things like poverty, mental health challenges, lack of education, and job opportunities, that might be what's holding us back from making communities safer in the long term.
So maybe focusing on those underlying social factors in addition to law enforcement would be a better long-term strategy. How do other countries approach crime prevention and public safety?
It's always good to see what's working elsewhere. Take Japan, for example. They really emphasize community policing with their local Koban police boxes, and they have very high levels of social cohesion and strong social safety nets, which all contribute to their super low crime rates, especially for violent crime. Or look at Germany. They focus a lot on rehabilitation programs for offenders and have really strict gun control, which probably helps explain why they have lower rates of violence and people reoffending compared to Canada.
It sounds like a more well-rounded approach that tackles both immediate crime and the bigger societal issues that contribute to it might be more effective. So basically, the report says that Canada's not as safe as it used to be.
That's what the data suggests they found concerning increases in violent crime, especially in certain cities, and that growing cybercrime threat, and unlike some other developed countries, it doesn't seem like the government's actions have really addressed the root causes of these issues.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at the big picture, the overall quality of life in Canada. Even with all the challenges we've talked about, Canada still has a reputation for being a great place to live. What does the report have to say about that?
That's a key question, right? So, in terms of some of the basic measures, Canada is doing all right. For instance, our average life expectancy is 81 years, which is pretty good and even higher than the US. We also spend a lot on healthcare, about 12.8% of our GDP.
So in terms of health outcomes and healthcare spending, we're in a decent spot. Are there any catches?
Yeah, while that life expectancy number is good, the report points out that not everyone has equal access to healthcare, especially in more rural and remote parts of the country. And when it comes to education, the average Canadian gets 13.5 years of schooling, which is similar to other G7 countries. But there's a growing concern about the rising cost of education after high school, which is making it hard for a lot of Canadians to afford, which could affect their opportunities later on.
So some of our traditional strengths are showing some cracks, but what about how Canadians actually feel about their lives overall?
This is where it gets really interesting. The report shows a pretty big drop in how satisfied Canadians are with their lives. Their overall sense of well being has gone down. In early 2024, less than half of Canadians, only 48.6%, said they were highly satisfied with their lives, which is down from over 53% just a few years earlier in 2021. That's a big change in a pretty short time.
Wow, that is a significant shift in how Canadians are feeling about their lives. What's causing this drop in life satisfaction?
The report directly connects this decline in happiness and life satisfaction to that increasing financial stress and the housing crisis we talked about earlier. All those anxieties about being able to afford things are having a real impact on how people feel about their lives.
So even though we have some decent scores on things like life expectancy, the day-to-day reality of financial pressures is really dragging people down. What role has the government played in all of this?
Well, the government's investments in healthcare and education have definitely helped Canada keep some of those advantages in terms of quality of life. But the report says that not doing enough about things like affordability and mental health has really contributed to that decline in well-being, especially for younger Canadians who are hit hardest by high housing costs and financial instability.
And how are we doing compared to other developed countries when it comes to this overall sense of well-being?
When you look around, you see some pretty interesting differences. For example, Japan, even with its own economic issues, has policies that encourage a better work-life balance, and they have universal health care, which helps explain why they report higher levels of life satisfaction. Or take France, they have strong worker protections and really good public services, which contribute to their citizens feeling more secure and generally better off. It seems like Canada is falling behind in this area, not keeping up with those other countries in addressing the things that really make a difference in people's lives.
So even though we have strengths in areas like health and education, this big drop in overall well-being, mostly driven by money worries, suggests that for many Canadians, things haven't actually gotten better since 2015.
Right. And to wrap up all the findings, the report basically says that Canada's position among developed countries has been slipping our inflation-adjusted GDP per capita, which used to be higher than the average for OECD countries, is now about the same, and it's predicted to drop way below average in the next couple of decades. Our productivity growth is slower than our main competitors like the US, Germany, and Japan, and our affordability crisis is worse than in a lot of other developed countries like Germany and France, where costs haven't risen as much.
So after looking at all this data about the economy, affordability, inequality, safety, and quality of life, what is the report's final verdict? Are Canadians better off now than they were back in 2015 when we compare ourselves to other leading developed countries?
Based on all this analysis, the report says that Canadians are not better off today in March 2025 than they were in 2015 when you compare us to other developed countries. So even though we've seen some economic growth, the reality is that for many Canadians, their standard of living has actually gone down because of that huge affordability crisis. The fact that productivity hasn't really improved and the growing sense of financial insecurity, inequality is still a problem. Crime rates have gone up in some key areas, and that overall feeling of well-being among Canadians has taken a hit.
And what does the report say about the government's actions over this 10-year period?
It says that while some government policies have definitely had some positive effects overall, the response since 2015 hasn't really tackled the big problems Canadians are facing, and in some cases, their actions might have even made things worse. The report specifically calls out a lack of focus and investment in important areas like productivity and innovation, and they say the response to the affordability crisis just hasn't been enough. This is different from how countries like Germany, Japan, and France have been dealing with their own problems, and they seem to be having more success. So basically, this deep dive into the data shows that over the last 10 years, Canada has fallen behind other leading developed countries in terms of how well off its citizens are.
Well, that's definitely a lot to think about. It's a pretty in-depth look at the situation. Lily, thanks for breaking down this report for us.
You're welcome, Edward. It's so important to look beyond just the surface numbers and really understand what's going on beneath the surface and how it's affecting Canadians.
I totally agree. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this deep dive into the big question of whether Canadians are better off today than they were back in 2015. If you found this discussion insightful and you want to explore these topics further or dig into other important issues facing Canada, make sure to subscribe to Dansplain for more in-depth conversations. You can also visit our website at www.dansplain.xyz for the latest episodes, articles, and lots of resources to help you stay informed. And as you think about all of this, what do you think are the most important things Canada needs to focus on in the next few years to turn things around and make life better for everyone here? That's something to ponder until our next deep dive.
Definitely lots to think about.
See you next time.
Bye.